I cannot think of a more important conversation that we should be having. And just for everyone watching, I am so honored to be here with Jonathan, because let me just set the scene for everyone. And I was just saying this to Jonathan when we were virtually backstage, but the last time I really laid eyes on Jonathan in person was October of 2018. It was a Saturday. I got called into work because I remember the initial reports of a shooting at a synagogue in Pennsylvania. And I will never, ever forget sitting on set for hours and hours, Wolf Blitzer tossing to me. I took it over for hours, and Jonathan Greenblatt came into the CNN studio. And I'll never, Jonathan, forget your words in such a harrowing, tragic time. And as in your book, you talk about this nightmare scenario, right? Of being woken up in the middle of the night, that there would be some sort of attack on a synagogue. And that was the Tree of Life that happened in 2018. And then since then, multiple, most recently in Texas. And so I have so many questions for you, but let me get to the first one. Do you think anti-Semitism in America, is it that we're just paying more attention? Has all of this been happening all along for years and years and years, or is this something that is on the rise?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say, Brooke, how grateful I am to be in dialogue with you tonight. I will also never forget that day and the sort of compassion that you showed and the presence that you showed in the face of such unspeakable evil. When our community was wrestling with the most violent anti-Semitic attack in American history, it left a mark on me as well. And I think so many, the millions of people who watched you that day. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
The ADL is the oldest anti-hate organization in America. We've been at this work since 1913, founded in the wake of the lynching of a Jewish man, Leo Frank, who was from New York, was falsely accused of a crime outside of Atlanta, wrongfully convicted, and ultimately hung from a tree. And while his body was still swinging from the branch, the people who lynched him set up a picnic and barbecued underneath the tree and took pictures and gave them out afterwards as postcards, as like souvenirs. And ADL was founded back in that time when there was rampant anti-Semitism in this country. Jews couldn't attend many universities, quotas kept them out. They couldn't buy houses in many places in the United States. Restrictive housing covenants prohibited that. They couldn't get medical attention at many places. The reason why we have all these, hospitals, named things like Beth Israel or, Cedar Sinai and so on, is because the Jews founded their own medical institutions. Many professions wouldn't allow them to work in them. I mean, I could go on and on and on. And what I would suggest is that the anti-Semitic attitudes were rampant and there was a kind of structural anti-Semitism. And over the course of the subsequent 100+ years, the ADL and other groups really worked to break down those quotas, overturn those housing covenants, expose the discrimination, make America a better, safer place for its Jewish community. We did that. And yet, what's real, what's here and now, is an explosion of anti-Semitism, the likes of which we have literally not seen in generations. And the data doesn't lie. We've been collecting anti-Semitic data at ADL, literally tracking incidents for more than 4 decades. Brooke, we've been doing it longer than the FBI, longer than any police department in the country. What I can tell you is, after almost a 15-year decline, in 2016, the number spiked 34%. In 2018, it went up 57%. That's the highest year-over-year increase we'd ever tracked. In 2018, it dipped 5%, but that was the year of Pittsburgh. And then in 2019, it hit a historic high. And then in 2020, a year when we expected the numbers would drop dramatically because we were all social distancing. College campuses were closed. Businesses were shuttered. People were all at home. In fact, the number did drop just 4%, and it was the third highest total we have ever seen. So whether it's acts of harassment or vandalism or violence, something is decidedly and empirically different today. And while many may call it the oldest hatred, it had been pushed into the shadows, and it's now burst forth into the mainstream in ugly and unfortunate ways.
You mentioned two things I want to follow up on. One, you mentioned 2016, and of course, one particular name comes to mind, and we'll get to that in a second. But then the further sort of exacerbating of anti-Semitism being the pandemic. You talk about the numbers starting in 2020. Do you think COVID worsened this?
There is no question that we have seen an ugly, if you will, mutation of the virus of anti-Semitism around the pandemic. Just 2 weeks ago, Brooke, I could tell you about flyers that were dropped in 6 different states, in cities like Houston, Texas, Annapolis, Maryland, Los Angeles, California, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm missing several.
Miami.
Miami, Florida. That's right. Flyers that said, COVID is a Jewish problem. And they were dropped on the front lawns in the mailboxes of houses that had mezuzahs on their front door. And we've seen, in the early days of the pandemic, people said that this was a bioweapon engineered by the Jewish people or the Jewish state. And then if you remember the early reports in 2020, after there were some Orthodox communities in New York City that were not complying with the COVID restrictions, like many communities, frankly, then they were saying, oh, the Jews are singularly spreading this problem. And then when Pfizer developed the vaccine, they said, aha, the CEO of Pfizer happens to be Jewish. He's from Greece. They said, aha, this was a Jewish plot all along to make money off the death of non-Jews. So we've seen this, and like associating Jews with viruses goes back to the Black Plague. It's a long-standing anti-Semitic trope. And unfortunately, we've seen it show up here today.
I just want to add the layer upon layer upon layer of all of this crescendo of anti-Semitism, and we'll get to politics in a second. But the other piece of this, and I know everyone's sort of thinking this in their thought bubble, is social media. Vitriol, and you write so much about this in your book, the vitriol of social media. I'm looking to my note. ADL's 2021 survey found that more than 2/5 of Americans have been victimized online by harassment, and more than a quarter of all Americans had suffered severe harassment. How, Jonathan, does social media play a role in essentially normalizing hate? And also just what needs to be done to stop it online?
Honestly, Brooke, this is really in many ways the $64,000 question, to use a reference. The reality is, if you say, well, what's different today than before? Certainly public figures like Trump and others routinely employing anti-Semitic tropes, that's different. We never had commanders in chief kind of using this thing. And I also think the country's more polarized than it ever was. And partisans from the left and the right have weaponized anti-Semitism. But it is indeed social media that's been a sort of super spreader of anti-Semitism. Social media, look, you come from CNN, you would never give airtime to these cranks, to these bigots, because, the network would be liable for what they say, let alone the fact that the network had editorial standards and ombudsman and all these sorts of journalistic ethics and practices. None of that applies on social media, despite the fact that it has an infinitely larger audience. Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and TikTok, history will not judge them kindly because their algorithms literally have amplified anti-Semitism and other forms of intolerance in ways that would make Goebbels blush. It's just extraordinary. And it's been probably the single most consequential factor in spreading this filth.
But then you have these executives, these billionaires who are sitting atop these companies who are like, we're doing our part. We're trying, as best as we can, or there's so much hate speech online. It's impossible to do it at scale. If these are the people who are overseeing these platforms, which this hate speech is just flowing, and they're not doing their part. I guess that goes to your point about the $64,000 question. What do we do about it?
Give me a break. What's hard? What's hard is to build a business that in 16 years, like Facebook, acquires 3 billion users and generates over $100 billion in revenue. Like literally, Facebook is the most sophisticated advertising or targeting platform in the history of capitalism. Like, want to know what's hard? What's hard is generating trillions of dollars in market capitalization. You know what's not hard? Knocking off some Nazis. So it is an insult to my intelligence to tell me that this is their biggest problem. Zuckerberg announced a couple months ago the intent they rename the company after the whistleblowers allegations or revelations, I should say, sorry. And they renamed it Meta Networks, and they announced all this focus on the metaverse. If he announced, and by the way, the company's lost like a third of its stock values, plummeted 30 some odd percent. If they invested the billions of dollars in fighting anti-Semitism and hate that they're doing in the metaverse, I would posit the stock would be performing better, shareholders would be more supportive, and society would be applauding them. Instead, by ignoring this problem, they've allowed the corrosive force of hate to eat away at our democracy. Because it starts with the Jews, it never ends with the Jews. It started with anti-Semitism, then you had all the disinformation, all the hate, and literally we're watching like our society's values crumble under the weight of Facebook's algorithms. It's astonishing, it's inexplicable, and it's just flat out wrong.
Can you not get through to him? Like, forget him, being on the hot seat. Maybe this is my lofty thinking, but, forget him being on the hot seat in Capitol Hill. How about the Jonathan Greenblatt hot seat? I mean, is that not within the realm of possibility for you to have a conversation?
I've had several conversations with Mark and other people in the company, and I will say, like, some of them are donors to us, and there are good people there, but there's a kind of collective groupthink, Brooke, that, again, the Jewish people, we know what groupthink is like. We have seen this movie before. But I'll share a story that's in the book. So I don't want to spoil the book, but I'll share a story. I had a meeting with Zuck and a few other executives a couple of years ago, and he said, and I'm going to paraphrase, but he basically said, look, Jonathan, a few years ago, all of the hate speech on Facebook was user reported. We didn't get any of it. He said, today, 88% of the hate speech is identified by our algorithms or by our AI, before you even see it. And so the users never even see it. So we think we're doing pretty good. And I said to Mark, can I tell you something? I used to be an executive at Starbucks. I didn't get to say, 88% of our coffee doesn't have poison in it. So we think we're doing pretty good. I didn't get to say that. And you don't get to say the fact, because the other part of your product is poisoning, the public. And here's the reality in any other industry, Brooke. Like, think about, to use some real examples, Johnson & Johnson. Many of you, the audience might remember, you probably remember the 1980s. There was a scandal with several bottles of Tylenol in Chicago had been tampered with, and people were sickened and poisoned by it. So J&J, this only happened in Chicago, it was a handful of bottles. J&J pulled every single bottle off every shelf in America and redesigned their packaging and then put it back out. And in the 1990s, there was a beverage company called Odwalla that was bought by Coca-Cola. Odwalla had one bottle of their juice that wasn't pasteurized correctly. An infant got E. coli and died from drinking it. And Odwalla pulled every bottle off every shelf in America, redesigned like the production process, and then put it back out. Facebook should do whether they're, the pharma companies or the beverage companies, any other business would do. If their product was broken, they would recall it, they would fix it, and then they would put it back out on the shelf. Why Facebook won't do the basics is literally beyond me.
Donald Trump, right? I remember sitting with you on that CNN set during breaking news for Tree of Life. And I remember having conversations with you about, listen, as you've pointed out, anti-Semitism has been around a really long time, but that with that man in the White House, he obviously emboldened a whole massive group of people in this country to not just say and do the ugly things quietly, but to do and say them out loud.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can just expand on that, number one, and what he did to America as it pertains to anti-Semitism. And also, Jonathan, we're all going to blink, and 2024 is right around the corner.
Yeah, for sure.
Who knows? I mean, let me just throw out this. Listen, I mean, he could run, he could win. There could be some ideological twin of his who could win.
Sure.
We never thought we'd see it coming in 2016. So what would that do to this discussion?
Well, look, so Trump in some ways is complicated. In some ways, he's quite simple. First, complicated. It's fair to say, and this is just frankly the truth, some of the people watching might like him. Some might dislike him. I don't really care if you're a Democrat or Republican, how you vote. I care about what you value. And what I'll say is that Trump came to office, Trump came to the job as a candidate, literally with a closer relationship to the Jewish people than any of his predecessors in American history. He has a Jewish son-in-law, a Jewish daughter. He had Jewish grandchildren in the residence of the White House. That had never happened for the 44 presidents who preceded him. It's just a fact. And by the way, I agreed with some of his policies on Israel. I really did, still do to this day. And he released an executive order on anti-Semitism on campuses that was right on the money. True. And yet,
so
it is also equally undeniable that he literally emboldened the extremists and gave a license to some of the worst parties in the body politic. What do I mean? Literally, from the time that Jake Tapper on your network asked him about David Duke and he denied knowing who he was, to him tweeting out that anti-Semitic meme against Hillary Clinton in July of 2016, to using the America First logo, to bringing on Steve Bannon as his sort of field general. I could go on and on and on. I mean, and we know at ADL that he emboldened extremists, Brooke, because we track the extremists. And when he was credentialing white supremacist media during his campaign, as he did, and when he would show up on shows like the Alex Jones InfoWars program, as he did multiple times, like this sent a signal to them. And we know that because we read their stuff and we listen to what they were saying. So like him or not, there's a straight line from the very quote unquote very fine people in Charlottesville to him telling the folks who rampaged through our nation's capital in the most predictable domestic terror event in US history, telling with their Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts, with their 6MWE decals, 6 million wasn't enough. And he told them that he loved them and they should calmly go back to their homes. I mean, I don't know who's missing the plot here, but he engaged in some of the worst prejudices against Jews, let alone other people, of any president in American history. So I am very concerned because I think that the people he emboldened are still with us, and the tropes that he normalized and the way that he weaponized anti-Semitism is still here. Now, look, I also have, Brooke, many times, I think on your show, I've called out the anti-Semitism from the left. I've called out members of Congress when, like Ilhan Omar, when she's engaged in anti-Semitic tropes. And I will continue to call out people on the left or the right? Whether you're demonizing the Jewish people or delegitimizing the Jewish state, I will call it out every time. But there's something quite different and consequential when the commander-in-chief of our armed forces is engaging in these kinds of myths. That's dangerous. And it was, deeply, disturbing for all of us who are paying attention.
For everyone listening, I just want to remind all of you, we're here through the hour. If you have questions for Jonathan, pop them into the chat. If you want to buy his book, if you want to buy 10 of his books and send them to friends and friends you wish would be reading Jonathan Greenblatt's book, the link is also in the chat page. before we get to just like the what do we do about it piece, my other question, and you mentioned, you hit on January 6th. And so you guys, as you point out, ADL has all this data. And so you have the data from a poll released just last week. 40% of Republicans think violence against America's government is okay. And 41% of independents believe violence against America's government is okay. Just 10 years ago, the idea that 40% of either party would say violence against the federal government is okay would be unthinkable. What?
I mean, it's crazy. And I got to say, you know, for my book, I talked to experts like Barbara Walter, who's a professor at San Francisco State University, expert on civil wars. And she said, I mean, she studied civil wars around the world, and she's never seen a moment like this in the US where all the lights were flashing. You know, we're flashing yellow and red. And I talked to Dan Ziblatt, who's a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard, who studied autocratic regimes. And again, all the lights are flashing. I think we should all be terrified. And this stuff hits home for me. And I'll give an example, or again, draw from the book, because this isn't just about ADL's work. Like, this is my life story. My grandfather was a Holocaust survivor, but was a German Jew, okay? Born in Germany, the only country he ever knew. And he never could have guessed, for the rise of the Nazi regime, that one day, again, the only country that he ever knew would turn on him, regard him as an enemy of the state, destroy everything that he ever loved, Brooke, slaughter almost his entire family and his network of friends, and force him to come to this country as a refugee. He never would have imagined. And my wife is an Iranian Jew. She and her family, she was born in Iran. It's the only country that her and her family ever knew. And they never would have guessed, before the Islamic Revolution and the rise of the Khomeini regime, that country would one day regard them as enemies of the state, destroy everything that they ever loved, and force them to flee for their lives and come here to America as refugees. So in the same way that my grandfather, a Jew from Europe, never could have guessed that his grandchildren, me, my brother, my cousins, will be born in America, and the way that my father-in-law never could have guessed, a Jew from the Middle East, that his grandchildren, my kids, my nieces and nephews, would be born in America, I don't think that I, as a Jew from North America, can just simply take for granted that my grandchildren will be born here. Because I have seen, but 70 years ago, but 40 years ago, the fact that it can all go away like that. And, you know, Lenin, there's this quote by Lenin, which you might know, Brooke. He said that, I'm going to try to get it right, that there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. And so I worry deeply, deeply about a country in which both sides are ready to go to war with each other, because as a Jewish community, we know who they come for first. And again, whether it's the extreme right who defame the Jewish people as illegitimate, saying we don't belong, saying we should, you know, go back to Israel, or it's the radical left defaming the Jewish state, saying that it's illegitimate, that they don't belong, they should go back to Poland. Like these extremes, you know, it's the spectrum, Brooke, isn't like this. The spectrum is like this. Yeah. And the hate that gets directed at us, deriding us as Jews, as Zionists, as this or as that. Again, like the last year, I mean, heck, it's less than a year ago. Jews are getting beaten up in broad daylight in Times Square, in Midtown Manhattan, on La Cienega Boulevard in Los Angeles, on the Strip in Las Vegas, during the fighting in Gaza, not because they were saying we don't support a two-state solution, not because they were saying, I don't know, they had opinions. They were getting beaten up simply for the crime of being Jewish. And then, you know, we had the situation in Texas and the flyers we mentioned. And last weekend, there was a Nazi demonstration in Orlando, you know, where Nazis brutalized and beat up a Jewish guy who happened to be on the periphery of the event. I mean, if it seems like Jews feel under siege today, it's because we are, and we need to take this deadly seriously. We just can't afford not to.
So what can we do about it? How can Jews feel safer in this country and around the world?
I mean, there's a lot, I think. I mean, First and foremost, we need people in public life to speak out clearly and consistently against anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. President Trump, President Biden, Speaker Pelosi, Minority Leader McCarthy. I think we need everyone in stations. And by the way, there's a chance here to talk for just a minute. It might seem crazy about Whoopi Goldberg.
I was going to get you there. Go ahead, Jonathan.
We'll go right there because for those of you, again, who might have seen what she said on last Monday on The View, where she totally got it wrong on the Holocaust, where she said it wasn't about race. It was about race. Maybe not the way some think about race today in America 2022, but it was a racialized anti-Semitism. Hitler said, like, the Aryan people were this master race and the Jews were a subhuman race. That's what he said again and again. The systematic extermination of the Jews was a matter of race. That being said, when it was pointed out to Whoopi that she was wrong and she apologized on Twitter and then to me on her show, like, I accepted her apology. And I accepted it, by the way, Brooke, because we have this Jewish value of teshuvah, of repentance. And when someone apologizes, I believe we don't need cancel culture. We need counsel culture. We can listen to people and recognize we all make mistakes. I make mistakes. We all do. And we need to see our common humanity. So I wished we could have used, I think we did the day I was on her show, it gave me an opportunity to talk about these issues to their millions of viewers. But instead of 2 weeks of suspension, how about 2 weeks of learning? And, how about we don't think about the Holocaust just on Holocaust Remembrance Day, but there are ways to learn from its lessons 365 days a year. So I think whether you're Whoopi Goldberg or Donald Trump or anybody in between, all of us should call out hate. All of us should acknowledge our errors. That's the first step towards stopping this kind of upsurge, I think, of intolerance and anti-Semitism.
The first step. Let's just pause on that. If one of us has a friend who speaks, I think your word was so classy. You said Whoopi spoke clumsily. Mm-hmm. And if we have a friend that does that, what do you say? Look,
I believe this very strongly. Whether it's at the water cooler or on the Zoom meeting or at the dinner table or in the locker room or on your Facebook feed. When you see hate happen, you've got to call it out. And we should use the opportunity, again, not to cancel, but to counsel, right? Not just to call people out, but call them in and educate. So when your friend says something clumsy, say, hey, let me explain to you why that isn't right. Let me explain to you how you could do that better. Literally, I have these kind of discussion guides in the book about whether it's in a classroom or in a workplace or, in a house of worship, how to address hate when it happens. Because we're talking very much now about anti-Semitism. It's my job. This is the 92Y. This is the moment. But it applies to anti-Black racism. It applies to anti-Asian hate. It applies to other forms of intolerance. Bring people in, help them understand, share facts. Like, don't, forward your weird uncle's neighbor's bizarro email about whatever conspiracy. Like, we should all dial it down a little bit. Try to be a little less emotional and a little more empathetic, I think.
You talk at the beginning and you weave it through the book, the sort of core premise of the ADL. America could not be safer for its Jews unless it was safe for all its people. And you touched on this a second ago, as we're seeing even just through the pandemic, because of the former president referring to it as a China virus, so many attacks, violent attacks on Asian Americans in this country. And then, of course, I've covered countless, attacks on Black and brown boys and women also in this country. And I know that the ADL, didn't you guys just recently redefine or you have your own definition of racism just this past week? Talk to me about that. Yeah,
so we had a definition of race. We've been doing anti-bias, anti-hate content in schools for decades. And we had it's funny, after the death of George Floyd, our education department had updated and changed the definition of racism on our site. It was brought to my attention and I took a look at it. And frankly, it was just incomplete. Like, it talked about racism being a function purely of the systemic racism based by, the systemic racism perpetrated by white people against people of color. Now, let me be clear. That is racism. And the reality of systemic racism is undeniable. And if you don't believe me, you can just look at the data, because the data doesn't lie. To see the data on sentencing guidelines, school suspension rates, reading levels, mortgages offered, and so on and so forth. It's undeniable. And yet, racism also can happen in other ways too. Like I think about the racism that Jews face, that my wife, again, who she doesn't present as white, the racism she faced, not just from white people, but from other brown people because she was a Jew. So we recognize the error and we fix the definition. And again, I think we come back to this issue. We live in this gotcha moment, right? Where it's like, oh, I gotcha. And people just want to call that out. I think we're much better off recognizing our shared humanity, and we're all flawed, and we all need to be on a path of self-improvement. So I'm glad we fixed that definition. We've got more work to do to examine all of our materials to make sure we get this stuff right. And we do that in a way which doesn't deny the reality of racism, anti-Black racism or otherwise. And we do it in a way which acknowledges the ever-presence of anti-Semitism, which is unfortunately, again, still with us today after so many years.
Tell us about your friend Damien, who he was and who he is now.
It's an amazing story. So Damien Patton, and I profile him in the book, is a person I came to know in the March or April or so of 2020. So he's a fellow a few years younger than me, was born in Southern California to a Jewish mom. He had what we might characterize as a broken home, and as a young person was a bit lost, got involved in gangs, and eventually, denying his own Jewish heritage, got wrapped up in a white supremacist skinhead movement. Got so enamored and enmeshed with it, he literally traveled to Tennessee to live with these white supremacists, and then was involved in an incident in Nashville where he was living in the car with two other adults when he was still a minor, and they shot up a synagogue, a large synagogue in Nashville. They were all arrested quickly thereafter. The other two men were arrested, confessed, found guilty. They pled out, they found guilty, and they served jail time. Damien was a minor, so he did not do any jail time. He was given probation, and he eventually kind of, if you will, internally recanted for being with these white supremacists, recanted his racism, if you will, his anti-Semitism. He ended up joining the military. After the military, ended up getting involved in tech, founded a very successful startup in Utah, a software company that was on its way to an IPO, until one day in the spring of 2020, when some reporter learned this aspect of his background that he had never been open about. He had never told anyone about his past. He thought it was, expunged from his record because he was a minor, but it all came out. He lost his job. He was booted from the company that he built himself by the board. And in that moment, in his lowest point, I got a call from a friend who's a venture capitalist, who was one of his early investors, who said, "Hey, Jonathan, you should talk to this guy." So look, as you know, Brooke, before taking this job, I worked in government a few years, but I spent many years before that in Silicon Valley. I used to build software products. I was a product manager before I ran my own business. And so I reached out to him and we started talking. And I found in this person someone who was deeply, deeply sorrowful, so apologetic for what he had done, living with this tremendous guilt. And this moment had not only kind of upended his life and really unmoored him, it also forced him to confront his past. And we ended up, Brooke, spending about an hour on the phone, and then hours and hours and hours. And every single week for well over a year, I spoke to Damien and helped him kind of work through these issues and developed a really strong friendship with him. And again, I come back to this view I have of teshuvah. I mean, I don't deserve credit for it. I think it's a Jewish value that many of us have, that you forgive people, you forgive people, you give them an opportunity to repent. Now, there are some who are just congenitally, if you will, intolerant, who don't want to do better. But in Damien, I found someone who did. And I feel really blessed by what I've learned from him over the years. And I was proud to feature him in the book. And I'm proud today to call myself his friend.
It's a beautiful friendship. We're starting, Jonathan, to get some questions. So let me just look down at my phone. Thank you all so much, and keep popping your questions in the chat. And again, buy Jonathan's book. All right, we got a question from Meryl. Meryl is going to take it back to we were talking about the executives and and these tech companies. And Meryl's question is, You mentioned your conversations with Mark Zuckerberg, but what types of conversations have you had with executives at Twitter, which is also a cesspool of anti-Semitism? Yes. And would you also focus on virulent anti-Semitism coming from the far left and the use of the word Zionism as some sort of a swear word and cover for anti-Jewish hate?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take both of those and I'll separate them, Brooke.
Yep.
So to the first question, we opened up, I guess it was 2017 when I came to this organization in 2015, but looking at the data, you could see that Facebook in Silicon Valley was the front line in fighting hate. So we opened up an office in Palo Alto, the Center for Technology and Society. We're the first civil rights groups and the first Jewish group with a presence in the Valley. And I didn't hire, Jewish nonprofit types there. I hired engineers, data scientists, software engineers, product managers to run that shop. And today we're doing some of the most, I think, important and cutting edge research and work to expose anti-Semitism and hate online. So I have met with Jack Dorsey. We have worked with Twitter. They've made some improvements, but still not nearly enough. We work with Google, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, all those social media companies. We've also worked with the podcasting platforms. That's getting a lot of attention of late because of the Joe Rogan stuff.
Yes.
We've worked with the video game companies. The issues in the video game space, Brooke, they are bananas. So much frightening stuff happening there. And we're now looking at the AR, the augmented reality and virtual reality space that's being described as, Meta, the metaverse. So we're looking at all of that. All of it's a problem. We work with the executives, but I got to tell you, I think the executives, some of them are better. Like I would say Reddit and YouTube are the best in terms of improving. I would say Twitter and Facebook are the worst. I think ultimately we're going to need government to engage and intervene and force the companies to obey the same basic rules of business that every other sector of the economy does. So that's that. On the anti-Zionism stuff, look, I've said it before, I'll say it again, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I don't expect as someone who believes in a two-state solution, who believes Palestinians need the dignity and equality of their own state. I don't think I would expect Palestinians who were displaced by the founding of Israel to march, down Fifth Avenue in the Israel Independence Day parade. Far from it. But the way anti-Zionism manifests today, we've seen it again and again. It denigrates, it demonizes, and it delegitimizes not just the Jewish state of Israel, but Jews all over. Again, I go back to what we saw happen in this city less than a year ago. Really, it's like 7 months ago, which was shocking but not surprising. And, the anti-Zionism stuff, it started with the Soviet Union as a tactic against America during the Cold War. They're the ones who pushed the Zionism as racism thing at the UN in the 1970s. And look, the Soviets were very good. From Soviets then to Putin on the border of Ukraine today, they specialized in propaganda. It's still with us, and it's as dangerous today as it was back then.
Here's a question from Anu. Jonathan, how has your group reached out to other marginalized and targeted groups such as Muslims, Hindus, LGBTQIA plus, et cetera, to help make this issue of hate resonate as a universal issue?
That is, Anu, I really appreciate the question. Like as Brooke said at the beginning, ADL was founded despite all the discrimination that Jews face. Literally, the charter that our founders wrote in 1913, they wrote the words that we still use today as our mission statement. They haven't changed in over a century. Our purpose is to, quote, stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all.
Yeah.
So ADL was founded on this almost intersectional idea that Jews can't be safe unless everyone is safe. And unless everyone is safe, the Jewish community will never be safe. So indeed, when I stood up against the Muslim ban and against the Muslim registry in 2016, when I stood up against the anti-Black racism that we've seen again and again in recent years, the police brutality and all that. When we, last year or in 2020, the ADL helped to incubate the Asian American Foundation, sharing what we've learned in fighting anti-Jewish hate to help those who are fighting anti-AAPI hate. more recently, like we've been engaged in talks with, the LGBTQ community about potential partnerships. But I think whether you are Hindu or Sikh, Jewish or Muslim, evangelical or Catholic or Protestant or have no religion at all, like we are all in this together because we were once strangers too. So even though I'm not an immigrant, my forebears were. Even though I'm not like a Muslim, I can appreciate the pains that Islamophobia puts on their community. And so I will stand up and speak out for the marginalized, irrespective of how they identify. Period. End of story.
Full stop. This next question, you sort of hit on what we can do about it, but this pushes it more, and it's such a nice question from Amy. Not nice, it's an excellent question. That's she says, so if we should all be terrified, what should we do? Outside of the option of studying conversational Hebrew and preparing to leave, wow. She says, what should or can we do? I assume that we have to work hard on the 2022 elections coming up, but beyond that, what? Says Amy.
Well, Amy, I think there are a few things. I mean, I do think, let me differentiate for a minute between anti-Semitism and how we as a Jewish community deal with that, and what I'll call this anti-democracy moment that, Brooke, you were alluding to earlier. So I think specifically with respect to anti-Semitism, I talked about speaking out, sharing facts and showing strength, which is this heuristic that we use at ADL. But I'll be a little bit more tactical, and a lot of this is in the book, but I'll be a little bit more tactical. So number one, I think I believe in this theory of safety through security and through solidarity. Safety through security. We do have to ensure that our institutions are fortified. There's a program, a DHS program called the Nonprofit Security Grants Program. It provided about $180 million to houses of worship and otherwise religiously affiliated institutions like JCCs, like the 92Y, to get access to cameras and locks and to better fortify themselves. And yet, I know there were more than $400 million worth of requests last year. They couldn't meet more than half the demand. We're asking the government to fund that program to the fullest extent possible, which can protect Jewish institutions and also, Islamic centers and Black churches and other houses of worship that need it. So I think we need security, but we also need solidarity. Look, Jews have the dubious distinction of being the most targeted religious minority. 60% of the faith-related hate crimes affect Jews, and yet we're only 2% of the population, which is a terrifying fact. But so let's say you believe the data. Let's say we're 7 million Jews in the United States. I don't think it's that high, but let's just go with that for a minute. Brooke, there's 340 million people in America.
Yeah.
So we as Jews have no choice but to be in solidarity with others because we are a tiny, tiny fraction of the public. So I think safety through security and solidarity is essential to our well-being. The other thing that I think ultimately, Brooke, matters, that's in the short term. In the short term, safety through, again, security and solidarity. In the long term, Brooke, it is all education. It is all education. Holocaust education matters. That's why ADL pushed, and we worked with Congresswoman Maloney from New York to get the Never Again Education Act passed last year that will mandate Holocaust education in all 50 states. Our own data tells us that Holocaust education, learning about genocide, decreases the level of intolerance. It increases young people's appreciation for pluralism. So education really matters. And for all the work that we do, ADL monitors extremists. We work with law enforcement to put away the bad guys. We push the social media companies to take stronger steps. We, do our best to work with the institutions. I'm proud of the fact that last year, our education programs reached 3.5 million kids. And that doesn't get a lot of attention. It's below the waterline, but educating kids about anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust, about hate is fundamental to our kind of theory of change.
As I've been listening to you and all of these things that you're doing, I can't help but think my mind goes to that rabbi in the Texas synagogue and about those couple of congregants who, the reality is, as he said, they were saved because they had been trained about worst case scenarios, if there had been a gunman who walked into a synagogue. When people walk into synagogues in this country, there is a whole other layer of security, fear that some folks have to endure because it's America in 2020 and we've seen what's possible. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to those fears, because it's such a, you're sitting in, it should be a place of peace and grace and beauty and spirituality has been tainted. If that's even the right word. Can you just speak to that?
Well, look, I'll just say, I worked for President Obama, and I was in the West Wing the day of the shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, which happened not far from where I grew up. And that was one of the worst days of my life. We're living in an age, unfortunately, where our schools, where our movie theaters, where our supermarkets, let alone where our synagogues aren't safe. And I think the threat of gun violence is arguably one of the biggest public health crises of our time. That being said, there's just no question that Jews are singled out again and again and again and again and again, delegitimized and demonized. And it's scary. I was humbled when Rabbi Charlie, in his first interview after the hostage crisis, he said, thank God we had training from the FBI, local law enforcement, the Secure Communities Network, and ADL, because that training saved our lives. And I was really honored when he said that. But the reality is, it's unfortunately a function of where we live today. So I think as Jews, whether they're white supremacists or Iranian regime enthusiasts or whomever in between, when they say they want to kill us, we have got to listen and take that seriously, which means ADL will be relentless in working with the authorities to put those kinds of people away, to push that kind of speech out of the public conversation. And at the same time, we're not just going to rely on that. We're going to do whatever we can to protect our community with, by all means necessary.
Here's a question about this most recent Anne Frank book from Elmar. Jonathan, any opinion or words on the latest book on Anne Frank, The Betrayal of Anne Frank, and the story being doubted by scholars?
The Anne Frank story is one of the best known stories that came out of, the 20th century. It's been well documented, well studied. I know there's this new book. I don't know if the claims it's making are true. I've seen a lot of criticism of it, so I don't really have an opinion about that. But I think Anne Frank's, a blessed memory. We need to keep in mind what she showed us about, the ability to retain hope even in the worst circumstances. So back to Brooke, your earlier question, this is a tough time, and the odds sometimes seem stacked against us. But I think, I believe in American exceptionalism. I really do. I think this has been the greatest democracy in the history of humanity. And it's certainly been the best place for the Jewish people. It has afforded us so much opportunity and so much privilege in a way. And so what I would say is that again, why I wrote the book is I don't think that this democracy is preordained. The outcome will be determined not by Hashem, but by all of us. And democracy is not a spectator sport. Democracy is not something you can watch from the cheap seats, from the bleachers, and eating your popcorn and think, I know how this movie ends. It'll all work out fine. Democracy is a contact sport, and you got to be on the field and ready to play. Whether you are 15 or you are 55 or you are 105, all of us can vote, volunteer, donate, engage, participate, and we have got to do that. Our shared society predicates on our participation, right? So I guess what I would say in terms of your earlier question, do you have hope and how do you deal with these things? You got that old lotto commercial, you got to be in it to win it, right? And I think that goes for all of us here today. So I was having dinner with someone last month, Brooke, and they said to me, they're Jewish in the United States, been here many years in Canada. And I said, Canada, wow, is that what you're thinking about if things don't work out? And he reminded me, he said, no, Jonathan, America is plan B. America is plan B for the Jewish people. America is plan B for the human race. And we have been plan B for my refugees, my refugee grandfather, my refugee wife. This is plan B. So we have got to make this work.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. I'm selfishly going to take one of them, which is, you mentioned the word hope. And I just had this image of you, Jonathan, like sitting on an airplane, and in the days when we weren't wearing masks and maybe we were friendly and talking to one another, and the person sits next to you and they're like, well, what do you do? And you hear these stories about, someone like Brene Brown, and depending if she feels like being chatty or not, sometimes she'll say courage and resilience, or sometimes she'll say shame. My work isn't a shame.
Right.
And, your answer is like, I work in the worst, ugliest spaces of hate in America.
Yeah.
I'm wondering personally why you elected to do this, like what that's like. And if you could point to one beacon of hope throughout all of this, what is it?
Well, it's funny. I mean, when I was working at the White House, I got a lot of calls from headhunters. I'd been a CEO and I had a public facing job. And, I usually ignored them because my plan was to go back to the business world after my public service. And I got a call from a headhunter about this job. And it was a voicemail. And I called my wife and I said, you're not going to believe this ridiculous message. The ADL's looking for a new executive director. They called me. Isn't that crazy? And my wife said, oh, that's a great job. And I was like, oh, it's a terrible job. You have to deal with anti-Semitism and racism and Nazis. Who wants to do that?
Yeah.
But it felt what you didn't know if you read my bio on whitehouse.gov. I had a bio on whitehouse.gov, was that when I was a senior in college, I actually interned at the ADL office in Boston, Massachusetts.
Full circle.
After seeing my grandfather's experience in Germany, and you can read the book, the first chapter talks about my grandfather, and I dedicated the book to my grandfather. I wanted to fight anti-Semitism. I went back to college my senior year. I learned about this group, the ADL, and I interned for a year. But then I'll tell you, Brooke, left it behind, went and do my own thing. Years later, after business school, I moved to Los Angeles. And a woman I had interned for at ADL Boston had gotten married and moved to ADL Los Angeles and had kids and so on and so forth. So I had just moved there. And I called this woman who I had stayed in touch with, said, hey, I just moved to LA. I don't know anyone. And she was a Jewish mother. So she said, please, I've got to feed you. And she invited me over for dinner. She did. And then, of course, she said, are you dating anyone? And I said, no, I'm too busy. My company's going to go public. I don't have time. And she said, let me set you up on a date. And so she set me up on a blind date with this young woman who worked at the ADL office in Los Angeles. And 22 years later, we're still married.
Oh.
So my wife actually worked at ADL for 8 years in Los Angeles.
People are applauding.
The funny thing is, Brooke, is that, again, the headhunter who called me, it wasn't my bio on whitehouse.gov, my college internship, where my wife had worked before our, second child, or all that. So the long and short is that when I got that call, Brooke, I felt like, you know what? I don't want this job. And they probably don't want me because I'd never run a nonprofit. I'm not even a lawyer. I know how to build businesses. I know how to ship product, not how to fight hate. But I said, I'll take the meeting because the ADL really matters. And, it has not been an easy job. The issues are hard every single day. But I'm being very candid here. It feels like a privilege and an honor. And I just feel really, really lucky. I feel really, really lucky to have the opportunity to be, trying to participate in this fight.
And a purpose and a call to serve, and always say yes when somebody, your friend or your grandmother asks to set you up. It sounds like that's the moral, that's the takeaway.
Listen to your grandmother, take that blind date. You should, all of you who are watching, tell that to your kids or your grandkids, go on that blind date. You never know what could happen.
Jonathan Greenblatt, it is an honor and a privilege to know you, to speak with you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And thanks to everyone in 982 Street Y. Thank you for having us again. You all go to the chat, go grab his book, buy it for all of your friends, buy it for the people who, again, really should be the ones reading this book. And Jonathan, thank you for having me.
Brooke, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It was a great conversation. I hope we can do it again next time in person.